Welcome everyone to this guest lecture for the AIBU course. We have Henrik Warpefelt visiting us over Zoom from all the way from Atlanta. And the title of his talk is NPCs and Acts of AI in Games. I'm so happy to have you here, Henrik.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Please.
All right. So thank you. So my name is Henrik Warpefelt. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Software Engineering and Game Development at Kennesaw University. And in the interest of saving slide space, the title of my talk is actually Non-Player Characters and the User Experience of Artificial Intelligence in Games. But let's never let a good acronym go to waste, so we'll just shove a couple of them in there. I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was requested that I provide some kind of background for myself. So I'm an assistant professor of game design and development. I did my PhD and my master's at DSV, where y'all are now. Actually, I'm familiar with the actual room you're in, which is kind of strange. So I do research on the user experience of games, in particular of novel tech like AI. I do a little bit of VR stuff. And right now I'm working on sort of narrative generation and simplistic narrative generation. And overall, what I'm interested in sort of is good design practices for novel technology in games, and AI being one of those things. I'm of course interested in how we design games for this kind of technology. And so that's the sort of background of why I'm the one doing this talk, right? I'm going to superficially start by talking a little bit about AI in games itself, because the default sort of layman's association seems to be non-play characters. So whenever I talk to someone about artificial intelligence in games, they seem to be very focused on the fact that we're talking about non-play characters and not necessarily all the other stuff that uses AI. And if you listen to some of the other research, like Georgios Yanakakis, AI kind of is everywhere. And this when he said this back in 2012, that was before we had this massive revolution of ChatGPT and all these large language models. So it's expanded even more since then. But we do use AI for a lot of stuff in games, like not just NPC behavior, but also for like controlling the story, like in Left 4 Dead, or generating assets. Like Speed Tree is one of the examples of well-working AI tech where it makes trees, and it makes trees fast, hence the name. But it's a fairly simple and well-contained product, right? And that really is what makes it successful. It does one thing and one thing very well. Lately, we've also started doing a lot of player data processing with AI, which of course also has a user experience, right? Partially for commercial purposes, where they're trying to sort of identify how to sell you more loot boxes, but also how to sort of adjust the difficulty dynamically. That's something they've been doing for decades already, but new AI tech is letting us train models that actually help us do this more efficiently and more effectively. In essence, AI is already both co-creating the game and co-creating the gaming experience. So we have this huge impact of AI that we don't always see if we think about this in terms of just non-player characters, right? I realize the irony of this in a talk, or me saying this in a talk, where I am going to talk primarily about non-player characters, but I wanted to establish a field where sort of this is something that stretches beyond just non-player characters. So a large part of what makes AI work, and I alluded to this when I talked about Speed Tree, for example, is that it has to be somehow accepted by the user. If we don't believe the outputs of AI or the outputs of an AI-created artifact or the behaviors of an AI-controlled artifact, we're just not really going to be interested in what that thing is producing and then sort of is giving us, right? So if the behavior of an NPC is sort of not up to where we would expect, well, then that will somehow negatively impact our user experience. At the same time, if this NPC portrays surprisingly solid and surprisingly coherent behavior, then that is something that will sort of further user acceptance and make the game seem better. So far, spoiling a little bit further in the talk, we've found, when I've done research project at DSV, but also later, is that a lot of this is based on achieving a lower bar and not breaking immersion. That's the most important bit, right? Not breaking the gaming experience of the player. And then after that, it's very difficult to climb further. So there's a whole bunch of different ways in which AI can influence this NPC behavior, the appearance of stuff, like do the trees make sense that come out of Speed Tree, for example, but also how interactable things are. Anyone who's played Oblivion, which by now is an ancient game, will know that the behavior of the NPCs in that game is inherently kind of wacky and doesn't really, it seems almost incoherent, right? Whereas for Skyrim, which is the current latest Elder Scrolls title, not counting MMOs, it's significantly better, even though that game is now ancient. A lot of this gets personified by non-play characters, like all these things, because non-play characters kind of, they form a cohesive little blob of all these things, and we kind of tend to view them as another person that we're interacting with, and that sets expectations fairly high. So if we can make NPCs work, we can probably make most other kinds of AI tech in games work more easily, simply because we expect so much from other people and other things that we interpret as other people. So if we're able to fulfill that, we will probably be able to fulfill a lot of stuff more easily. I think those productive way of thinking about this is that a game is inherently telling us a story, right? When we're walking through a game world, the environment of the game tells us some kind of narrative. It provides us with anchorings for where we are and what kind of environment this is. And that, again, sets expectations on what will happen here. An example I use is if anyone's watched the movie Bright on Netflix or is familiar with Shadowrun, in those worlds, like we have just orcs running around. Whereas if we, in the real world, were to encounter an orc on the street, we would think that's pretty weird. But the other game has sort of, through the environment and through all the stories that they're telling us, tell us, hey, it's a normal thing to find an orc hanging out in Los Angeles. It just happens, right? So by providing these kinds of narratives, the game actually provides an encapsulation for what we would consider to be believable and acceptable and interesting, and what we would accept as output from an AI generator. And there's multiple ways of thinking about this. Jenkins famously talked about embedded and emergent narratives. So embedded narrative being the stuff that you put in the game, and the emergent narrative is sort of the experience that comes out of interacting with the embedded narrative. I think Kalea's approach is better. He talks about predefined narrative, which is sort of the stories you put in the game as a developer. Of course, this becomes tricky when you start thinking about large language models building narratives and stuff like that, because you're essentially creating the thing that's putting the narrative in the game. But the most interesting way of thinking about this is, I think, is Kalea's autobiography, which is kind of the story of how I played the game told from my experience, my first-person experience as a player. So it's not Henrik spawned in with Paladin in Goldshire and ran down to the tavern, right? It is that I spawned in as a Paladin and ran down to the tavern. So it gives my first-person experience, which is inherently how I perceive the world. So if we start thinking about sort of narrative for games, and especially generated narratives and the narratives that come out of non-player character interaction in those ways, it makes much more sense for us for how to analyze this as a user experience. And essentially, there is some level of micro level storytelling in games. Like Clara Fernandez Vara, for example, famously talked about indexical storytelling, which is how a large part of environmental's narrative happens. Well, I would make the argument that it's not just the environment performing this thing, but it's also every other critter you see in the world provides some kind of thickening for this whole soup of narrative that the game is constantly telling us. And by looking at these little indices, they will be picked up and interpreted by the player and turned into a narrative somehow. I'll explain a little bit more about this later when you start getting to actual models for how we analyze these things. But why am I blabbing about narrative when this is about user experience? Well, UX is inherently a narrative-full experience or exercise. It's kind of how we understand most things. We tell ourselves those stories about what we're going to do today, or what we've done today, or how things are going to be. So we inherently create these little narratives of experience or expected experience. And UX has taken this and essentially turned it into tools that we see in a lot of UX stuff. So we have user stories or scenarios, or even personas, or created by Bjorn here, playsonas, which are inherently things we use to create these stories. I mean, user stories are inherently called stories, right? To let us make sense of experiences. And applying that level of thinking to when we also create AI experiences, and when we start looking at the AI experience, allows us to create this link between narrative and user experience that provides a good framing for this kind of autobiography thinking, where we're sort of looking at the first-hand experience of the user. Hooking back into Fernandez Vara's idea of indexical storytelling, we also have this idea of significance coming from details and artifacts in the UX theory. Like Norman famously talked about signifiers. If you've read The Design of Everyday Things, you'll be very familiar with that. I've worked on that together with people from the department, so Björn Stort and Magnus Johansson, and also Harker Verhagen, and to some extent Mirjam, on something called indicators, which is essentially the Norman's concept of signifiers moved from just objects to virtual people, which is NPCs, or the entirety of the gaming experience. And those little details in cohesion provide something called character. We're going to delve deep into what character is here, because I think that's something that needs to be explained for this talk to make sense. I want to note that this is not the same as the non-player character. It's not just NPCs. It's actually a separate concept. So let's talk about the character of things. This was created by two Swedish researchers called Jan Lert and Stolterman back in 1997. And it's an interesting theory, partially because it represents one of the early stages of moving from thinking about usability to thinking about user experience. But essentially, it's how we understand how something is something. How do we understand what a sports car is, for example? And in each of our heads, we have experienced a bunch of artifacts in the world, and we've created something called a repertoire of character, which is my individual understanding of what makes a sports car, for example, or what makes a nice desk or a nice laptop, right? It's how we know that the MacBook Air is supposed to be light, and we know that a Dell XPS 15 is supposed to be slightly heavier, because we have this idea for how these materials work. And we have some kind of coherent conception of what these items will be as we view them. And this also works for games. If we've played a lot of games, if we pick up another Souls-like, we will know that it's probably going to be similar to Dark Souls or Demon Souls or Elden Ring or whatever. And by playing off of those stereotypes, we can create kind of interesting experiences, but also by breaking those stereotypes, like, for example, the Dragon Age series did with elves, where they turned them from these like haughty, highly advanced critters into fairly downtrodden underclass, essentially representing some kind of, I think they're going for a parallel for the Irish underclass in Britain during the Troubles and all that. We can sort of reverse these stereotypes and create interesting experiences that way, by playing on the unexpected. An example of this would be this. So, Mirjam, maybe you can see if anyone wants to. You can give me a count here, Mirjam. Who thinks that the 1983 DeLorean is a sports car? And then we can reverse that and take your hands down and reach up again. Once she's counted, who thinks the Volvo is a sports car?
Hang on, it was 8 first. I was unmuted. I was muted.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so
So
say
8
the
for the
question
DeLorean.
again. Yep.
So it's 8 people think the DeLorean is a sports car. How many people think the Volvo 244 Turbo is a sports car?
0.
0. All right.
Yeah.
Well, here's the funny thing. Right? If you look at the DeLorean, it looks sleek, famously from Back to the Future. It's kind of low to the ground. It's very aerodynamic. It's got all that going for it. It is actually slightly slower than the Volvo 244 Turbo, which looks like a brick with pretensions. So what we think of as a sports car, the first thing you think of is usually, oh, it's fast. But the DeLorean isn't. It's actually famous for not being fast at all, and it's famous for having kind of bad suspension, to the point where the Volvo 244 Turbo is actually a better sports car, but it looks nothing like it. So our repertoire of character that makes us go, oh yeah, sports car, isn't necessarily related to the power of the car or anything like that. It's related to a bunch of different ideas we have of what a sports car should be. Sleek, low to the ground, looks fancy, looks like it costs a lot of money, stuff like that. And the DeLorean is a great example of this because it fundamentally kind of isn't a sports car, yet it is. Right? Performance-wise, it is absolutely not a sports car. It's slower than a Volvo. Okay, a turbo sedan, but still a Volvo, right? A regular brick on top of a brick. But it still captures our imagination, makes us go, oh yeah, this is a sports car. So there's something to this. Right? So if we go back to talking about character, we have a repertoire of character of sports car-ness in our head that we don't really apply to anywhere else, or that we apply to everything we encounter. The tricky thing here is that this becomes culturally inherent. So as someone who's moved from my home country to another country, this is something I encounter pretty much daily, even though I didn't move to a very different culture than where I'm from, right? But there's a culture inherent to character that we sort of interpret in a way. So if we're from Sweden, we're going to interpret things in a certain way, and we're going to go, oh, that seems weird, but it's probably be completely normal. I think we apply some, apologies for butchering this, Baudrillard to this. We can talk about his theory of the simulacrum, which is a copy without an original. Wagner, in a stroke of genius, in a book called My Avatar Myself, which I highly recommend reading, talked about simulacritude, which is the nature of being a simulacrum. A simulacrum, being a copy without an original, is sort of the instantiation of an idea that we have. Someone's taking this fictional narrative and put it in the game, or put it in somewhere. Like they've taken a narrative and instantiated it and realized it. Disney World is a really good example of this. I have another slide here explaining similacitude. So these things both have the character, if anyone's been to Bavaria, but these things both have the fundamental idea of a Bavarian village. Like they present a lot of the characteristics, at least on the surface level. But if you start looking deeper at this, you'll realize that this is fundamentally not Bavaria. It is in fact a town called Helen in Georgia, which is really cute. And if you're ever in Georgia, I recommend visiting because it's a strange experience if you've ever been to Bavaria. Or Leavenworth in Washington. And once you start looking more closely, you'll see like there are some things that aren't necessarily things you would find in a Bavarian village. For example, there's American flags in both of these towns, which you, for some reason, would not find in Bavaria, probably. But there's also an inherent sort of feel to the place that isn't necessarily Bavaria. Thank you for zooming in, Mirjam. That actually helps to show off all the detail here. So there's a certain feel for this that we go, this is weird because it doesn't look like Bavaria. Superficially it looks like Bavaria, but it doesn't really, right? And of course, as Europeans, we often go like, well, of course the Americans have cut and pasted stuff from other places and just turned it into a tourist attraction. And there is some kind of Disneyfication going on for these two places, although maybe more towards geared towards adults than geared towards children. However, is this a Bavarian village? Mirjam probably knows the answers to this one because I know she's been here. All right, Mirjam, can we get a show of hands? Is this a Bavarian village?
So we have 3 yeses for Bavaria.
And how many no's do we have for Bavaria?
Say again?
How many no's do we have for Bavaria?
Okay. 1, 4, 5, 6. 6.
You've seen through my clever ruse. Yes, this is actually Visby in Sweden. So the thing is, what we think of as it does look like a Bavarian village, and I'll prove this to you in a second. What we think of as a Bavarian village is actually just maybe sort of Northern European medieval stuff. And looking at the American copies of this, well, of course, people will be a little confused because they look like kind of weird and kind of not Bavaria, but also like Bavaria. And same thing here with Visby, like it looks like Bavaria, but not Bavaria. This over HDR'd image that I borrowed from the internet is actually an actual Bavarian village. And if you squint a little look closely, you'll see some pretty significant similarities to what Visby and those American towns look like. So we have this idea of the Bavarian village in our head, and then we go look what these sort of copies, right, from the US ones are actually intended to be copies, and the Swedish one, that's sort of a accidental copy because it's just heavily influenced by the same culture. And we go like, oh, maybe it does match kind of well anyway. That's weird, right? And thus we have maybe expanded our repertoire of character for how we understand, or at least understood the difference between the sort of simulacrum and that's been projected through someone else's cultural understanding and the simulacrum that we've created through our own cultural understanding. Because remember, there's a certain subjectivity here, and my interpretation of a Bavarian village may not be the same as yours, right? And whenever we design something, there's sort of something called an intended versus an apparent product character. And I should credit Björn here for this theory, because he is the one who started working with it as applied to games. Essentially, when the designer creates something, they manufacture a product, and they have an idea for how it's supposed to be interpreted by players, an intended product character, if you will. However, once the person using this artifact starts poking at it and using it, they will have a slightly different experience called the apparent product character, which is where they sort of start applying their cultural filter to this this thing that they're interacting with, and interpreting the character of it into something that is not necessarily what the designer had in mind for it, but maybe close enough that it kind of works anyway. I used some of Björn's research, and I'm going to say was inspired by, but I guess we could also use the word stole. His idea for this. This is my reinterpretation of Hassan Sahl's model as applied to games using indicator theory. Essentially, once you start designing a sort of a product, you decide on a bunch of stuff. You want some content, some presentation, some functionality in there, and how you interact with it. And that leads into a designer intended experience. It has two kinds of attributes: hedonic and pragmatic. Pragmatic is the functionality, hedonic is sort of the experience inducing stuff. And these are in games difficult to separate, although you could maybe separate them in like a word processing software or something. But generally in games, these things tie hard into each other, right? And in the end, that essentially turns into a pile of indicators, these little things, little details of stuff that just make up the game. Everything in games is made up of this. Like we saw with the Bavarian Village, there's a bunch of little things in there that tells Bavarian Village, or sports car, right? Same thing here with the game. Something is telling us Souls-like, and stuff like that. The player then takes this pile of indicators that they bought, called a download from Steam or a game on disk if you're in the Dark Ages still, and they interpret this through their situation, like where they're playing it, what their previous experience is, what kind of expectations they have on the game and stuff like that, and that creates a player interpretation of this. And they perceive some kind of functionality that they can do with this game, and they have an expected experience that they want to have with this game. And that, in turn, then leads to the player experience. There's kind of a positive or negative thing here. It could be positive, could be negative, depends on sort of how well the player's interpretation matches the thing that was presented. Fundamentally, I think the important thing to remember here is that it's different from the designed intent. In this talk, we're more focused on these two boxes, and especially I'm talking about fundamentally about this, right? That there are some expectations and that this leads to an expected experience. An interesting example of this that I found, this is made by a student of mine for her bachelor thesis back in 2018. These are all images of Viking women as interpreted through the different lenses. On the left-hand side, we have the more fantastical. On the right-hand side, we have the more historically accurate. So she did a survey of this and to see how people interpreted this. And funnily enough, wrong way, here we go. She found that American respondents tend to favor more the fantastical interpretation, whereas Swedish respondents, because these were the two main groups that she was able to gather data from, tend to favor the more historically correct, where they tend to say that this is a Viking, because they were asked to pick the Viking out of a lineup of these kind of little dolls, or these little drawings of Vikings. And if we think about this, it actually does make sense, because if you grew up with the left-hand side being your so the Chris Hemsworth as Thor, if that's your interpretation of Vikings, then it does make sense that you would go for the more fantastical thing. If you grew up with the Swedish interpretation of Vikings, say Franske Bengtsson's Röde Orm series of books, or all the stuff we're taught in school, then you would probably have a conceptualization of Vikings that is more towards the historically accurate one, right? So all these expectations, these things act to set expectations in ways that are maybe culturally differentiated too. And that's something you need to think about when you start designing games, especially with AI tech. What are you actually generating, and what is this leading into? Because your cultural biases and what you build into that generator could have pretty severe impacts on how people interpret things, and it may even make the game incomprehensible to some audiences. If we move, I've talked a lot about the visual medium, and that's because it's sort of this format lends itself very well to this. Let's move beyond that real quick. This is a game agent matrix, a product of DSV. I did as part of my PhD with Björn and Magnus and Harko. Essentially, behavior can be grouped into different categories here of what we expect. I'm not going to break this down because I realize that we are running slightly low on time, and I'm starting to run over. At least I can finish my argument here. But if in the abstract, looking at this, simple behaviors like just following routes or using tools and stuff that we can easily just attach to the hand of a player of an NPC in the game engine works great. Once we start getting to stuff like having social interactions, coercing people, having group conflicts, or showing disillusionment, NPCs are kind of bad at this. And this is true 10 years ago, and as far as I've been able to tell, it's still true. It's just difficult to do these things. Now, large language models would help us be able to generate behaviors that maybe are able to do stuff like this, right? But so far we haven't seen it. Ironically, Cultura Historica, which is more about societal stuff, that moves slower than individual social stuff, it's actually easier to make and can kind of work. Like, it's easy for us to build institutions and roles, because institutions and roles usually don't go away. Like, the king doesn't go away without major societal upheaval. So if we just assign the king flag to one of the NPCs and people treat him like the king, that just ends up working for us, right? Because we don't expect that to change quickly, whereas we maybe expect to see disillusionment in real time. So this is about setting expectations, and also about how we interpret these things. I'm going to run through some examples of non-play characters, and we'll discuss the various design criteria and how we how things would have gone into these. So here we have 4 examples of people, or some kind of creature, at least a human-like creature, human or human-like creature. Mirjam, can we do one quick audience participation thing?
Yes, for sure.
All right. So, which one of these will not fight you? Can people, if you think it's number 1, hand up.
No one?
Remember, no one. All right. Number 2.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Right.
9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
And how many people do you have in the room? About 13.
Yes.
All right. No, will people think number 3 will fight you?
Okay. 1. 1.
One person thinks they won't fight you. All right. And will number 4 not fight you?
No, they won't fight you.
They won't fight me. All right. Great.
Zero. I mean, 0 people thinks they will.
I think they won't. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Pretty obvious, right? Because if we look at the body language of number 1 here, an orc from Space Marine, he is obviously has got some anger issues, and he's making his displeasure known here. Number 4 has an actual weapon. In number 3, the player has a weapon, and these people, maybe you also play the game, but they look like regular NPC mooks that you would be shooting in a shooter game. Number 2 is a weird one out, right? Because she's making a pretty socially relevant gesture. She looks like she's in a conversation rather than in something that's a kind of fighting scenario. She is from LA Noire. She's one of the early interview subjects in LA Noir. So the class is correct, but you can think about why we think that way, because we've put some thought into these. Like number one here and number two are essentially from what is fundamentally some kind of cutscene. Number three is from a sort of interactive set piece, and number four is from just the open world in Skyrim. We have some conception of how these things are expected to behave based on what we're seeing. But let's turn this around. All right, let's now ask. So for number one, it's the black car in the middle that we see the back of. For number two, it's the tank that we can barely see because it's cleverly camouflaged. And for number three, it's this news van. Which of these are non-player characters? Anyone think number one is a non-player character?
Okay. How many for number one? No one for number one.
All right, for number two?
One. Okay, so 2.5.
2.5. All right, and for number three, remember it's a news van, not the motorcycle.
It's 10 for number three. Just for the record, just for the record, that anyone who's watching this video much later, the students here are not like generic students. They're games and digital media students. So
yeah, so they're pretty proficient in this.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if we look at this, for number one, this is again from LA Noir. I actually don't remember who's driving in this scene, but thing is, it could be an NPC and the player's just along for the ride, right? Because it could be the player's partner driving or the player driving. For number two, this is a tricky one. This is one of your units from Company of Heroes. So it's a tank, right? But we don't usually think of tanks as non-player characters, especially if they can be sort of subsumed and controlled by the player. But the thing is, they do exhibit some kind of autonomous behavior when they're not being actively controlled by the player. If this is an enemy unit, then of course it's a manifestation of some kind of enemy AI, right? But I think there's a strong argument to make for this being a non-player character, at least to some kind of transitive property of being controlled by the player, but also having autonomy. And there's a gray area here between being sort of a minion of the player, where it's controlled by a character of the player occasionally, but also has their own limited free will. Like they'll stay in the same spot, or they'll patrol back and forth and attack enemies, depending on their orders. But you also have stuff like your party in Mass Effect, where they can kind of do stuff on their own, but they can also be ordered, but less directly than a unit in a strategy game. But fundamentally, it's just set dressing. Like you have a closer personal relationship to this character because they've been characterized as such, whereas the unit is just a faceless mook that's been produced here, a literal tank. So our expectations on these characters are different than what we would expect from, say, a party member in Mass Effect or role-playing game. Number three is just straight up an NPC van. And I think there's a strong argument to be made here for this being an NPC because it's completely AI controlled. Like it's just traffic, right? But so are the cars on the left in the LA Noir picture. But the question is, when do we start thinking of things as non-player characters versus thinking of them as being, I don't know, AI, I guess? So they do exhibit some level of characterhood here. We expect these cars to behave like cars. And the reason we expect cars to behave like cars is that they're driven by, up until very recently, humans. Or we have AI systems mimicking human driving, hopefully doing better than the average driver. But when we still have these expectations, right? Like LA said in the 50s, there are no driverless cars in the 50s. So all these have to have a person behind the wheel. So they're sort of an extension of an NPC. All right, let me move on here to talk about how this interpretation, this is from Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and it's in combat. And I've talked a lot about, you can look at these minute details, and there's a whole bunch of small things that you need to interpret. if you're in a situation like this, where it's messy, it's quick, there's a screenshot, but there's a lot of motion blur going on, there's a lot of details, there's blood spatter and particle effects and stuff all over the place, right? It's kind of difficult. You have to track these three people at the same time. It's difficult for us to, in the moment, read all these details consciously and make a decision. Whereas instead, this kind of high pressure situation relatively puts this into a much more intuitive thing. So we can't always count on the player doing I wonder if kind of process. Instead, they have to do this kind of processing where they have to react instantly. So there's also finer detail that we need to consider here. In how people will be able to encounter these things. And to be fair, these guys are the faceless mooks that you keep killing throughout that game, and it doesn't really matter that they're faceless because we're not going to notice it once we're engaged with them because they serve a role where that kind of interaction is sufficient to fulfill their role. I'm going to do one last example here before we go into questions, which is this screenshot from GTA 5. Whenever I show this to American students, they go, "Oh, it's a barbershop," because it does look like an American barbershop. We can easily see that the role of the woman here in the purple cardigan or the purple jacket sweater thing, she's a shopkeeper, and we know that because she's in what would be considered a shop. She's got an actual cash register and a counter, right? And we know it's a barbershop because of the chairs and because of all the accoutrements that are set up here. And it does have kind of a, this vintage barbershop feel that you see in some American movies. In this case, we're able to do that kind of evaluation of this environment because we can spend a relatively long amount of time in it. Whereas in the earlier situation with Assassin's Creed here, the environment itself has to tell us a story, but the NPCs that are in it are maybe less. They have more leeway than they would otherwise have. Conversely, she has to portray this role of the shopkeeper pretty well. So I'm going to end this talk with one single thing and talk about No Man's Sky, specifically why No Man's Sky didn't work out. To be fair, I'm going to be fair and say that they've done a lot of work since release. The game has improved significantly and is a lot better now. But this is kind of what they sold us, right? This magnificent world with interesting penguin lizard creatures and stegosaurus likes. And these all seem to, just from a picture, seem to have reasonable behavior. They're kind of, various critters walking around in woods, in pastures. It's very pastoral and nice. And you can see some kind of robot scanning something at the distance, right? But when they released the game, we got this. And that is not really what you would expect the fish to do, is it? Instead, that is something that just fundamentally just counter to how we've been taught that fish act. To be fair, I mean, whales do breach, but they don't really do it this way, where they stand on their head in shallows. I think most water creatures are not able to do that. And this is a good example of how, when things go wrong, how they can go wrong a lot, right? And how you need to be mindful of what you're signaling to the player, because there's a lot of stuff in this procedurally generated landscape on the right here that really do not match what was sold. There's no grass. There's some kind of weird mushroom thing, and that's about it. There's a fish standing on its head rather than all these magnificent creatures, right? So setting expectations, especially for AI generated stuff like No Man's Sky, where they sold it on being trillions of interesting worlds, and instead it turned out to just be various bowls of oatmeal, to use Kate Compton's analogy for this, really makes the point for why this is super important to think about, why you need to think about the user experience early on as you're creating the generator. All right, with that, I think we're ready to go to questions.
Thank you so much, Henrik. I will first ask around in the room if you have questions. I have one question for you, and that is,
Shoot.
We've been talking about agents today, and now you have given this expose of like expectations for NPCs and AI in general. Kind of thinking in the recent development with with all the craze with OpenAI, how do you see agent research and believable agent research going?
I think believable agent research has, in some ways, I mean, it's lived a nice and interesting life in academia, right? But I think it will become more relevant because the struggle with believable agents has always been, how do we make them believable, right? Like, we can develop a lot of theory, but the practice of making them believable, because making believable behavior is incredibly difficult, mostly because humans are fantastic at improvising stuff. So for us to try to figure out that kind of believability, I think it's going to get easier. Although if you start playing around with ChatGPT, for example, being, the GPT models, you'll see you can find the limits of the generative space pretty easily. I think Cardano Rivera calls this a kaleidoscope effect, right? We start seeing the patterns pretty soon. Like if you ask ChatGPT to write a story, it will write you a traditional moral story. One of my friends says she's an English professional Englisher. She writes a lot of copy and stuff, and she said it likes to use a lot of adjectives, and I hadn't realized that until she said it.
Oh. Do we have any questions from people online? We have one in the room too, but the guys online can think about whether you want to ask any questions. You can type the questions in the chat if you have any. But we have a question in the room as well.
Yeah. So where does the distinction go between intelligent AI and NPCs? Does an NPC have to be sentient or like exhibit sentient behavior, or can a car be an NPC if it is controlled intelligently?
So here, I think that's a really good question. Thank you. So for the recording, the question is like, what's the border between an artificial intelligent thing and an NPC? I would say that as long as it fulfills the sort of being characterhood, which is a concept that I stole from Dennett and bastardized into talking about characters. As long as it fulfills what we would expect from a character, right? And that bar is pretty low. It fulfills some kind of role in, say, a narrative, and being that games are sort of continuously feeding you a narrative. Well, I guess anything that acts in there is a narrative. I realize this is kind of an unsatisfying definition and answer, but the thing is, we don't have a good conception of these fuzzy borders of what makes an NPC. I will freely admit that I think there's an argument for that little tank from Company of Heroes not being an NPC, but I also think there's an equally strong argument that it is an NPC, because it does somehow it portrays some kind of characterhood. It moves in a way that we expect from something that is human controlled. It gives human soundbite responses and stuff like that to make us think, oh yeah, there's maybe a human in this thing. The same thing with the cars in LA Noire, that you can see the driver, for example. But they are sort of an extension of the driver, much like we ascribe intention to cars in real life because we know they're probably driven by humans or something that's been trained by humans.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, there is one more.
Sure.
In games with multiple characters, for example, GTA, when you switch from one character to another, do the other character completely down? Because if NPCs tend to know non-player character, non-agent character, and you can clearly play as the other character, what does it count as?
Did you hear the question?
I did not quite catch that. I know so GTA and the other characters, and that's about what I caught.
So let me repeat the question once more. I'll try to interpret it better. Yeah, when you have multiple playable characters.
You switch to one character to another. What happens to the original character? Will it count as a NPC now or not?
So if you switch from one playable character to another playable character, what happens with the original character that you kind of left, right? Is that what you mean? And that's GTA.
Right, GTA 5 has three primary protagonists, right?
Right.
So when you switch from Trevor to Franklin, for example, in GTA 5, the character you leave becomes an NPC because it's now a non-player character because it's not being controlled. It's kind of like how in in D&D, sometimes you leave a character to become a character in the world and it's controlled by the DM, right? And that's essentially what happens here. Since the player now has sort of, the ghost has left the machine and is now being controlled by the all-knowing computer instead. They become a non-player character. So I guess being a character and being a non-player character, that non-player is sort of a transitive property that arises from whether the player is currently inhabiting this or not. Which is why Wagner's book about avatars is so interesting, because essentially the character you're playing in GTA 5 is an avatar while you're playing them, but then you have several missions where all of them are on the same mission. You're just not playing that one or two of the particular three characters at the time, right? So they behave maybe differently than you would as you're playing it.
There is a question waiting in the chat, but it needs to be formulated.
Sure, yeah, I see that.
Yeah, sure.
I don't mind them using the microphone, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes,
I can, yes.
Yeah, talking about like NPCs and AIs, I got reminded about a video I saw where this guy put AI in Skyrim. He modded a companion NPC and put like ChatGPT or whatever inside that companion, and they were reacting to his, command, like his conversation. He could have conversations with them. He could, talk about his streaming while being in Skyrim, and they would respond accordingly. Is that something you think could come more in future, or is it just like a fun thing? I mean, I don't know. Like, like, have you heard about that?
I hadn't heard about that specific example, but I've heard of several research projects people are working on putting these large language models in games. Thank you for the question. This is actually an excellent question. I'm going to reference some of Mirjam's research for this, where she talks about the essentially how game developers dislike giving up control. And I think that's especially control of design. And I think that's one of the things that hindering acceptance of LLMs or large language models and stuff like that, like ChatGPT in games. I think this is a really cool thing to do. And we've seen, for example, Facade tried to build around this kind of interaction where you can sort of interact with naturally, in air quotes here, with NPCs. Doing this in Skyrim, I think, is a cool thing, because Skyrim is weird already, and it makes you accept a lot of weird behavior from NPCs in the base format. So people who've played Skyrim will accept a lot of strange behavior from NPCs. I hope it's the future, but I think that we will need to understand large language models better, and specifically how to limit their output so they don't. That's traditionally been a problem with all chatbots, that it produces non sequitur output that can be immersion breaking. And that could be problematic for the believability of their behavior. Or it could just, like if you saw Microsoft a bunch of years ago released a Twitter bot, X bot now, called Tay. And it took about 15 minutes before she was a raging racist, because people just kept feeding her stuff. And that's a problem that you also have to encounter in games, that suddenly you don't create sort of a fascist uprising in Skyrim or something. That would be kind of terrible.
That's a great answer. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
We spoke a bit about flat characters and round characters, and to like quickly convey characters' motivations, we usually use archetypes and tropes. But does that like automatically become a flat character? And how can you use different methods to avoid that?
So the question was about having round, rich, and deep characters versus flat, boring NPCs, like flat characters in Forrester's sense. And saying that since in order to quickly convey something, we use archetypes and tropes. But how in architecture and building NPCs would it be possible to overcome that? Was that the right interpretation? Yes.
Something like
I don't think you need to overcome it, because we ourselves use archetypes and tropes to present ourselves. Like what you choose to wear every day shows some kind of belonging to a subculture or something, and that will inherently create a certain archetype or stereotype of who people will interpret you as, because that's something we intentionally try to play on, right? We're doing it more fine-grained than kind of just like, I'm going to dress like a black metal musician every day, right? Or I'm going to dress in a suit and a three-piece suit every day. It's not necessarily usually that heavy-handed. It's more of a sort of flat thing, especially in countries where we have a more social cohesion, or more social, how do I put this delicately, how we have less social variance. So where people express themselves differently or not as flamboyantly as in other countries or other cultures. Where am I going with this? So I don't necessarily think that we need to get away from these stereotypes, because we use them in all kinds of media, right? Especially in games. And it is useful for us to use this shorthand to better understand what this character is about. Because if you think about any movie you've seen, they do give you a couple of hints like this. Okay, this is the kind of character you're working with. All right, it's generic brown-haired action guy. We kind of know what he's going to be like. He's going to be gruff. He's going to be quiet. He's going to curse occasionally, or he's going to be sarcastic brown-haired action guy, right? Usually played by Chris Pratt these days. So we already use these tropes. I don't think we need to go away from them. I think we can just keep using them, because they're a time-honored tradition in all of our interactive and non-interactive media already. Not saying that we should, embrace racist stereotypes. That's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm saying that we're kind of doing this already with the kind of tropes and stuff. So why not keep doing it? It's obviously working.
More questions? We were talking about having like rich characters and using ambivalence as well, like inherent conflicts and stuff. But there was lots of things covered today, and we are running out of time here. But before, I just want to check if there's anyone wanting to ask something in the chat. In that case, Henrik, it's been an honor to have you. Thank you so much.
It's been an honor to be here.
And I'll hope to see you soon again. And
Absolutely.
a last applaud before we end.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.